Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about developmental psychology. Our last lecture was on object relations theory, which, while it was connected with personality, is also a developmental theory because it talks about the way the infant develops in relation to its environment and the way that development and the relationship with the caretaker impacts later development and adult development and later childhood development. So that lecture was really a nice bridge into this lecture on developmental psychology. And later, when we talk about attachment theory, we'll see some direct correlates with some of those earlier object relational theories, as John Bowlby had actually been supervised by Melanie Klein, even though many of his own theories and his own ideas about development were much different than Klein's. Okay. So, when we're talking about developmental psychology, we're really talking about what shapes the way we change over time, what processes take place throughout our lifespan that impact who we are, who we become, the way that we see the world, right? Every area of psychology can be looked at from this perspective, including biological development, social development, cognitive perceptual development, and again, personality development, particularly when we're looking at more psychodynamic or psychoanalytic forms of theory that really indicate or connect with personality development. Now, the general stages of development are outlined here as in the chapter, with prenatal being considered the conception to birth time span, where infancy is considered birth to 2 years. Now, infancy is really the period of time that object relations and attachment theory focus on as being a very important and crucial developmental period for understanding later personality and personality development. Something I want to emphasize too about object relations theory versus classical psychoanalysis is the fact that the reason why there was such a focus on early development was the fact that the people during the time that they were developing object relations theory were actually coming into contact with people who didn't seem to fit the earlier conceptions of psychopathology as outlined by Freud and earlier psychoanalysts. They were seeing people who were not neurotic, right? Were not ridden with guilt because of their unconscious sexual and aggressive impulses, but were really oriented toward some other kind of developmental process. And these were folks that would later become known as individuals who have characterological or personality problems. And personality problems are considered to be, from a psychoanalytic perspective, considered to have developed at a much earlier time frame than later neurotic issues. As we talked about, neurotic issues, as connected with Freud's theory, were really organized around the Oedipal period, right? Well, people who are considered to have personality or characterological issues are considered pre-Oedipal, and that language is used a lot in the object relations and psychoanalytic literature. And what that means is that their developmental conflicts or their issues are centered at an earlier period, not during the Oedipal drama, but during infancy, during the oral phase, right? And then childhood is considered 2 to 12 years, right? Adolescence is 12 to 18 years. Young adulthood is considered from 18 to 40 years. I only have a few more years in young adulthood myself, unfortunately. Middle adulthood, 40 to 65 years, and late adulthood, 65 years and older. Now, he's not really, I think he's mentioned in the chapter, but since we covered him in the personality lecture, I kind of left him out. But from a psychodynamic analytic perspective, Erik Erikson is really the only person that outlines a detailed developmental theory throughout the entire lifespan. He talks about different conflicts and tensions at pretty much every period of development, including the last period of development, which would be that late adult period. Now, there are some fundamental issues to understand in personality or in developmental theory. There's this idea of nature versus nurture first, which is basically a question of what is the role of heredity versus environment in determining psychological makeup. And this has been a fundamental debate for quite some time, and certain schools of thought tend to take up different positions, right? Where, even in psychoanalysis, classical psychoanalysis, even though it's not a full nature theory, has a pretty heavy leaning towards understanding human development through the lens of our biology and our instincts. Whereas later object relations theorists, sort of post Melanie Klein, would be considering the developmental environment more so than the biological instincts, right? And even in thinking about other forms of personality theory, when we talked about personality in the last lecture, there were different forms of personality theory, including the biological form, which is concerned with the way our internal brain structure and our internal bodily makeup impacts our personality and who we become, right? You know, questions around heredity versus environment often revolve around things like IQ. You know, how much of our intelligence, quote unquote, because there's even a lot of controversy over what that means, is how much of that is inherited versus comes through our environment. You know, is there a criminal gene, right? Or, you know, if we're thinking about psychopathy or sociopathy, the question remains as to how much of that is based on biology, our biological makeup versus our environment. There's a forensic psychologist who practices from a psychoanalytic frame named Reed Malloy, and he outlined in a paper that he wrote called A Psychoanalytic View of the Psychopath that idea that there is research that suggests that for more mild to moderate forms of psychopathy, that there is a higher connection with environmental influence, with external development, essentially how they were treated, what trauma was going on, what was going on in the environment, right, is correlated highly with mild to moderate forms of psychopathy. On the other hand, he found an inverse correlation with environment in relation to more extreme forms of psychopathy. So here we might even be thinking of people who murder, you know, serial killers, mass murderers. These would be considered severe forms of psychopathy. And what he found there was that development in terms of the external environment didn't have as much of an impact as as for people who are considered mild and moderate range for psychopathy. So basically the implication there is that perhaps in more severe forms of psychopathy, there is a large genetic component, right? And is sexual orientation a choice or genetically determined, right? These are all major questions in the nature versus nurture debate. It seems like the general consensus among psychologists and people who work with others in the helping professions and scientific psychologists really believe that it's an interplay between nature and nurture. And that really is true in psychoanalysis too. Another fundamental issue is related to the idea of developmental continuity versus a sort of stage-based discontinuity. Right. And what this basically means, or what this is kind of getting at, is a curiosity about, you know, does our development can develop continuously, meaning that later developmental phases are catalyzed by earlier developmental phases. Like they continue to develop throughout, as opposed to being a stage based where it's like, okay, I've completed this developmental milestone. Now we move on to this one, and then to this one, and to this one, and implying that they don't have a thread within one another, that they're not somehow connected, right? Okay. The stage theory, there's distinct phases to intellectual and personality development. Continuity development is continuous, right? It keeps evolving based on earlier developmental experiences that continue to stick with the person in some way. So physical and psychological development as related, you know, are they correlated in some way? Our physical, biological development, is there some kind of correlation with our psychological development? Physical maturity sets limits on psychological ability. Visual systems not fully functional at birth. Language system not functional until much later, right? Prenatal environment can have lifestyle influences on health and intellectual ability too. Now, talking about prenatal development, conception is considered when the sperm penetrates the ovum. The zygote is the fertilized egg after the sperm penetrates the ovum. Germinal period is the first week after 2 weeks after conception. The embryonic period is week 3 through 8 after conception. And the fetal period is considered 2 months after conception until the baby is born. And I've included a few slides that just kind of indicate what the baby looks like as it's developing in utero. Right? This is an 8-week embryo. This is a 12-week fetus. And here we can see the eye development, the ear, the umbilical cord, the spleen, and the rib. Here we have an image of an 18-week fetus, of a 20-week fetus, 24-week fetus, 28 weeks, 32 weeks. Okay. Now, there are certain prenatal influences on development, including nutrition, mother's anxiety. If the mother is really anxious, that creates an uptick in chemicals such as cortisol and adrenaline, which can impact the child's neurological development. Mother's general health, their age, teratogens, are considered any agent that could potentially cause a birth defect, such as drugs, right? If the mother is a heroin user or a cocaine user, radiation from a job site or through medical testing, and viruses and other diseases. Okay, now this slide shows, in relation to fetal alcohol syndrome, the difference between a quote-unquote normally developed baby's brain on the left and a baby's brain who has fetal alcohol syndrome due to the mother's alcohol abuse. Now, on the left, we have an infant who is malformed due to thalidomide. Now, this was a big problem in the 1960s. In the 1950s, they developed this drug called thalidomide, and it was a sedative, and it has several different uses. But what they didn't realize was that that drug, thalidomide, if the person who was taking it, if the woman who was taking it was pregnant, often caused severe birth defects and malformities. And here we have an example of what that might have looked like. Right? Now, Jean Piaget, we're talking about his theory of cognitive development. He was a Swiss psychologist who became a leading theorist in the 1930s. Piaget believed that children are active thinkers, constantly trying to construct more advanced ways of understanding the world. His theory is one of constructivists, right? It's about the way in which our cognitive capacities and development help us to understand the external world and make sense of it, right? For him, cognitive development is a stage-based process. Piaget's approach related to his primary method, where he asked children to solve problems and question them about the reasoning behind their solutions. So that was his sort of experimental method for developing his theory of child cognitive development. He would ask children to solve problems and then ask them to kind of work through their process with him so he could have a better understanding of the way in which these capacities developed, right? Discovered that children think in radically different ways than adults. Proposed that development occurs as a series of stages differing in how the world is understood. Now, he had a few stages, the first being the sensory motor stage, which occurs from birth to 2 years old. And this is basically where information about the external world is gained through the senses and through motor activity. The baby understands the world through what they can see, what they can hear, what they can feel, what they can touch, and in terms of their mobility, how their movement correlates or connects with the external world. So their understanding of their environment is simply based on their sensorium, their 5 senses, and their motor ability and motor actions. Child perceives and manipulates but does not reason. So they can perceive the external environment and they can manipulate it, meaning they can move things around, they can change things, but they can't reason. They can't understand the external environment. They can't internalize it. They can't make sense of it. Symbols become internalized through language development. Okay, so until the child begins to develop language, the ability to speak, there is no internal kind of census around language or symbol, right? Object permanence is acquired during this time. And basically what that means is that children who are pre-object permanence in terms of their developmental state don't understand that when something or someone is out of sight, that it still exists. So if the mother comes into the room and feeds the baby, right, the object is there, right, for the baby. It's experienced. But if the mother leaves the room, the baby, before it has this object permanence, doesn't realize that the mother still exists. And that is true for any kind of object or person: the father, siblings, a teddy bear, anything, right? So once the object permanence is acquired, which happens towards the end of the sensory motor stage, the child understands that these objects, including people, exist even though they are not right in front of them, that they continue to exist. Qualitative difference in thinking. Piaget developed a few ideas, one of them being assimilation, which is a process of taking in new knowledge or a new experience, and accommodation, a process by which we change our way of thinking because of new knowledge, right? These processes build on the knowledge of previous stages. So in some ways, his theory is stage-based, but it's also continuous because other earlier stages or other processes impact later developmental processes. They're all kind of connected. Earlier processes are required for later processes to develop. Okay. Object permanence, we already talked about that. Before 6 months, the infant acts as if objects removed from sight cease to exist, right? Can be surprised by disappearance and reappearance of a face. Peekaboo, right? That's why the game's so fun for little babies, is because they literally don't know that when the face is gone, that it still exists. So when it reappears, there's a lot of excitement because it feels like there's a new object or experience right in front of them. The next phases of Piaget's theory are the pre-operational stage, which is the years of 2 to 7. It's the emergence of symbolic thought through language, the lack of concepts of conservation, animism. The child is egocentric. Animism is the belief that inanimate objects are actually alive. Conservation is basically the idea that objects are the same even though they might be in different containers or in different forms. So before the ability to understand conservation, if you were to give a child 2 different cups but fill them up with the same amount of water, they wouldn't understand that just because the receptacle has changed, the cup, that the water, the amount of water remains the same, right? If you had a smaller, thinner glass and a bigger glass that was a bit more bulbousy, they would probably think that the thinner one had more water because it would look like it was higher, right? Even though it was, say, the same amount of water. Say both receptacles had a cup of water in them. They would think that the taller, skinnier one had more water because the water level was higher, right? But later on, when they develop the understanding of conservation, they realize that just because they're in different forms does not mean that they aren't the same, okay? Concrete operational period is the years between 7 and 12. Children can increase in logical thought. They begin to develop the ability to classify and categorize objects and concepts in the environment. They become less egocentric, right? So what that basically means, and what egocentrism is the sense of believing that everybody has the same perspective as you, that your perspective is somehow indicative of everybody else's too. So what happens is that children between the years of 7 and 12 become less egocentric, and that they develop a theory of mind wherein they can kind of take ownership over the fact that other people have different ways of seeing things. I remember when I was in undergrad, they talked about, the professor, Dr. Altman, talked about an experiment where they placed a child in front of a dollhouse, and on the other side they placed a bear or a doll. And they asked the child to discuss what the bear might be seeing. But what they did before this ability, or before this sort of ability to become less egocentric happened, was the child actually described their own viewpoint, what they were seeing. What that indicated was that they believed that the bear's perspective, what they were seeing, was exactly the same as theirs, meaning that they didn't have the ability yet to consider that what the bear was actually seeing was a different view of the dollhouse, right? Now, formal operational stage, this occurs between the years of 12 and through adulthood, right? Hypothetic deductive reasoning occurs. This is really related to even the ability to construct scientific method. It emerges gradually and continues to develop throughout the lifespan. Yeah. Hypothetico-deductive reasoning is characterized by creating a hypothesis for an observable phenomena and then deducing a number of other phenomena that should proceed from the hypothesis. Right, the ability to undertake the scientific method, essentially. Now, the critique of Piaget's theory is that it underestimates the children's ability. It overestimates age difference in thinking. There's a vagueness about the process of change. It underestimates the role of the social environment. It has a lack of evidence for qualitatively different stages. Okay. The next theorist that we're going to talk about is a man named Lev Vygotsky. Okay. And he worked from a socio-cultural perspective in relation to his developmental theory, which emphasized the child's interaction with the social world and other people as a cause of development. So in some ways, Vygotsky corrected for Piaget's lack of really discussing the way that the external environment and the social sphere impacts development. Vygotsky believed language to be the foundation for social interaction and thought, whereas Piaget believed language is a byproduct of thought. Vygotsky's developmental theory of social cultural theory of development, where the individual development is embedded within a social matrix. He also came up with this idea about the zone of proximal development, and this is especially useful for people in education, okay? What this basically is an indication of is the distance between the child's actual developmental level and the higher level of potential achievement. And his idea of scaffolding is related to helping the child from difficulty to solo efficacy. This is through the educational process. So basically, if you understand where the child is developmentally and what they've already kind of conquered and what they're already able to do educationally in relation to their ability, in relation to the difficulty in their thinking processes, if you make the material in relation to education a little bit harder than that, that helps to move them beyond where they're already at in terms of their development into the next phase of their development, to something even more difficult. And again, in relation to education, that's what he called scaffolding, right? That helping of the child from one phase of development into the other towards something that's a little bit more difficult. The next theorist that we have is Kohlberg, Lawrence Kohlberg, who assessed moral reasoning. His theory was one of moral development, and he assessed moral reasoning by posing hypothetical moral dilemmas and examining the reasoning behind people's answers. He proposed 6 stages, each taking into account a broader portion of the social world. Now, his levels of moral reasoning were pre-conventional, right, where moral reasoning is based on external rewards and punishment. So the way that in this phase that a child would understand morality would be based on what is rewarded and what is punished. So it comes from the external environment that indicates for me what is moral, what is morality, what am I being rewarded for, what am I seeing other people being rewarded for, and what is being punished, right? Now, conventional, so that's where laws and rules are upheld simply because they are laws and rules. So you can see that. So first we go through this period where our moral reasoning, our understanding of morality comes from observing other people's reward and punishment, and also experiencing our own reward and punishment for our behavior. And then shifting into this idea that the rules and laws that are kind of already in place are upheld simply because they are considered rules and laws, right? We don't have our own way of reasoning about why they may or may not be moral or may not be good or useful, because a lot of laws and rules sometimes are actually really oppressive. and are sometimes really oppressive for groups of people, certain groups of people. But when we're in this state of the sort of conventional moral reasoning, we just take them up and we abide by them because they're simply accepted as truth, right? Now, Kohlberg also developed this theory of a post-conventional moral reasoning where it's based on personal morals and standards. Now, when we're in this sort of post-conventional space, that's where we're really able to engage in activism, right? So if we think about some of those oppressive social structures that are in place, and if we're thinking about even the police force and some of the major problems that are going on there, activism against some of those oppressive structures is really predicated on this post-conventional moral reasoning, right? That's one example. There are many other examples. We can even think in our own schools when we see processes or rules that feel oppressive or feel unjust in some way or feel like they're even exploitive, right? If we're in a post-conventional space, we don't accept them as they are just because they're rules and laws. We're able to really think about the way that those rules and laws impact potential people and groups of people and what kind of harm they could possibly be doing, right? Okay. So here we have Kohlberg's stages, the pre-conventional, organized around obedience and punishment, naively egoistic orientation, the conventional, the good boy orientation, authority and social order and maintain orientation, right? And the post-conventional, contractual legalistic orientation, conscience or principle issue. So this breaks down each level into its two phases, right? Yeah, and with the post-conventional first being organized around this contractual legalistic orientation, and then beyond that, the conscience or principle orientation, where we're able to evaluate the system or the structure or the rules based on our own understanding of morality and really able to see the implications. Okay. Now, Carol Gilligan kind of wanted to expand on his theories, and she developed the idea of individual survival, moving from selfishness to responsibility, self-sacrifice and social conformity, and then the idea from goodness to truth, morality of nonviolence. So she kind of added to his theory based on her own critique of his theory. Now, the next one, and the one that really connects with object relations theory, is attachment theory, right? This idea of the quality of attachment. Parents who are consistently warm, responsive, and sensitive to the individual's needs usually have infants who are securely attached, right? Parents who are neglectful, inconsistent, or insensitive to infants' needs usually have infants who are insecurely attached, right? There's secure attachment, there's ambivalent attachment, there's avoidant attachment, and there's what Mary Main identified in the 1980s, I believe, as disoriented, disordered, or disorganized attachment. Now, the main theorists in relation to attachment theory are John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth and Mary Main. But the idea of attachment really started prior with research by people named Harry Harlow and also a man named Konrad Lorenz. Harry Harlow wanted to test out what seemed to be more important to primates, right? Was it food? Was it food and that kind of experience that was more important? Or was it contact and comfort? So what he did is he used these little rhesus monkeys in his experiment, and he created two different mothers, quote unquote, right? One of them being wire, but having a bottle that they could feed on, right? And the other being a cloth monkey that had no food, no nourishment, but was very comforting and was very warm. What he found was that the rhesus monkeys would go to the wire mother, the wire monkey, just for the food, but they wouldn't cling there. They wouldn't stick around. They would go to the cloth mother actually for contact and comfort, regardless of the fact that they didn't have actual food. So what that indicated for Harlow was that primates and humans are actually more oriented to contact, comfort, and connection as opposed to just the gratification of their physical needs. And in some way, this tests out some of Freud's ideas too, right? But I think that they're also connected because I think that we can both be oriented to need gratification and want comfort, warmth, contact, and connection. Okay. So what his experiments showed was that social isolation leads to serious problems. Normal development requires affectionate contact. Lack of social contact rather than lack of parents cause the problem. Lesser periods of isolation may be overcome. Longer periods cause irreparable damage. So the longer the are isolated from their mothers or their caregivers, the more problems develop in the personality throughout the lifespan. So John Bowlby, before we get into Ainsworth's strange situation, sorry, I can't talk today. We'll talk about Bowlby. Now, Bowlby was a student of Melanie Klein, right? But as we discussed before, Melanie Klein's theory of development was very much based on the way the infant's temperament, their split off feelings of love and hate that emerge within them naturally, colors their external environment, right? That's what's called a biopsychological model of development, right? Well, now, Bowlby really disagreed with Klein on this. He felt that she was too interested in internal intrapsychic processes as opposed to what's actually going on in the external environment, right? So he actually wanted to study the impact that certain developmental environments would have on children, right? And he came up with his own idea about attachment. And for Bowlby, attachment was related to ethology, which is the study of behavior, right? So basically, his hypothesis or his theory is organized around the idea that infants have to attach to caregivers for their survival, right? There's some kind of instinctual mechanism in there that causes us to attach to our caregivers, because if we don't do that, we die, right? We have to entrust our care and our need to somebody else. And the way that that comes out is through attachment, right? And when we attach, we can make sure that we get our needs met, thereby continuing to propagate our species. So there is something biological in it. But for Bowlby, it also had to do with the actual content of the caregiving environment, what was being offered by the mother and by the environment, right? That would indicate the way that people attached. And there were different types of attachment that would develop later on in the lifespan and throughout child development, right? Now, Ainsworth, who was a student of Bowlby's, came up with an actual way of testing out empirically these attachment styles and seeing how they play out. She used to study quality of attachment in infants, observes child's reaction when mother is present with the child in a strange room, observes the child's reaction when mother leaves, observes the child's reaction when mother returns. So what she would do is she would videotape this strange situation paradigm. So there would be a mother and a baby in a room, or a mother and a child in a room, and they would play for a little bit. And then they would introduce a stranger into the situation, okay? And then the mother would leave the room for a few minutes, okay? And they would observe the baby's reaction when the mother left the room. And then the mother would come back in after a few minutes and they would observe the reaction when the mother returned. You know, does the baby cry and get really upset when the mother leaves? And then when the mother comes back, do they reunite really quickly and do they seem to have their bond restored very quickly? Or does the child indicate some other kind of process? Does the child react to the mother's return with avoidance, where they don't seem to care? Or do they cry and bite her, right? Or do they scream and get upset and appear to be anxious when the mother comes back, okay? And that indicated the attachment, right? So the theory being that when the child is secure, they're able to separate from the parent. They're able to seek comfort from parents when frightened. They're able to return to parents when met with positive emotion. They prefer their parents to strangers. They have a trusting, lasting relationship. They tend to have good self-esteem as adults. They tend to be comfortable sharing feelings with partners and friends and seek out social support. So for a secure child, what would happen when the parent leaves the room is that they might be a little upset, but they were okay. And when the mother came back, they would reunite pretty quickly and in a pretty smooth fashion. And something that's really important to understand about attachment styles is that empirical research has shown that your attachment style when you are a child is very similar to the one that you have as an adult. This is something that continues with us throughout the lifespan. Now, if we're securely attached, which I believe that they said that something like 60% of people are securely attached, that's cool. But for the other 40% of people who have avoidant or ambivalent or disorganized attachments, that can provide problems for us in later life. We may not trust other people. We may have difficulty in social relationships. We may completely avoid other people entirely, right? Or we may be, wary of strangers, right? If we're avoidant, again, we as a child avoided our parents when they came back in relation to the strange situation paradigm. Those babies didn't seek much comfort when their parent returned. They showed little or no preference between the parent or the stranger, right? When we're talking about the strange situation. And in class, which is going to be on Big Blue Button this Monday for everybody, and I'll send out that link and also the schedule for which classes will be in person versus online. I might show a few videos that are on YouTube of this strange situation paradigm. So again, if we have problems in our attachment later on as a child, which follow us into our adult lives, we might have some serious interpersonal problems and we might be suffering, right? And that becomes a part of our personality. But the good news is that research also suggests that a comforting relationship later on in life that lasts for at least 5 years, that does develop intimacy, over a longer period of time, can actually help to shift a person's attachment style. The same is true for psychotherapy. The research has suggested that 2 years of psychotherapy, intensive psychotherapy, can also help shift a more insecure attachment style to a more secure attachment style. Okay. This also really relates to social relationships. Parent and child relationship is usually positive, right? When we're able to have social relationships, we may have some periods of friction or conflict. Peers soon become increasingly important. So basically what happens is that through our attachment phase, through our attachment system, when we become more securely attached, we're able to kind of move outside of the parent relationship to develop other social relationships, right? There is an analogous theory, like for Melanie Klein's theory and in object relations. We have to kind of learn to separate from our parents in order to develop other types of relationships, whether they be romantic or social, right? And in Klein's theory and in some of the early object relations theories, the father's role was essentially to help that process, right? To help the process from attachment, right? Dependency to being able to connect with people in the external world, right? Now, when we're talking about parenting styles, there's a discussion of Baumrinn's theory of the 4 different types of parenting styles, right? And they developed the authoritarian, the authoritative, the permissive, and the neglectful style that they observed when they were doing their research and watching families interact with one another and watching the parents as they kind of constructed rules and boundaries, right? The authoritarian is where value obedience is used to a higher degree and power assertion, right? Right. The authoritative is less concerned with obedience, greater use of induction. The permissive is more tolerant and least likely to use discipline. The neglectful is completely uninvolved. So the authoritarian is basically, the authoritarian parenting style creates an environment high in obedience, high in expectation, but low in warmth, right? It's not a very supportive environment. It's very cold, right? The authoritative environment, on the other hand, is one that is high in expectation, but also high in warmth and support, right? There might be a lot of expectation of their children, but there's also a lot of support and encouragement and a lot of love and warmth. The permissive environment is considered to be low in expectation, but high in warmth, right? So there's a lot of love and a lot of support, but there aren't a lot of expectations, right? as far as the person's behavior, the child's behavior is concerned. They can kind of do whatever they want, but there's a lot of warmth and a lot of love. Neglectful is simply uninvolved. There's low warmth and there's low expectation, right? That's probably considered to be the most dangerous or most damaging parenting environment. While as Whereas the authoritative environment is considered to be the most optimal, right? Having that really, I was going to say strict structure, but not so much strict, but certainly having a lot of expectation, having that structure in place for expectation of the child, while also again being very loving and warm. That helps people to achieve later on. That helps people to develop this internal sense of mastery or efficacy, right? Okay. And then just talks about adult development, talking about genetics and lifestyle combining to determine the course of physical changes, social development, involving marriage and transition to parenthood. Paths of adult social development are varied and include diversity of lifestyles, right? That's pretty much it. As I mentioned in class, I didn't really love this chapter, to be honest. Um, yeah, but that's okay. The most important theories really are those of Piaget, Kohlberg, Vygotsky, and definitely attachment theory, right? So it's 1:43 on Saturday, so you'll have the rest of today, all of tomorrow, and Monday until 6 to listen over this and write down any questions or thoughts. We'll meet over Big Blue Button on Monday at 6, where we will talk about the chapter. We will clarify any questions. I will prime you just very generally about the exam. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that because in thinking about it, everybody has the resources available that they need to be successful on these exams via the PowerPoints and the lectures and the questions that they can ask. And then when we do have the quiz, which won't be Monday, but will be the following Monday, the exam, not the quiz, the exam, I will post it at 6 on Monday, next Monday, and you will have 48 hours to complete it. And it'll be 30 multiple choice with maybe a bonus question or two. Okay, so it shouldn't be too bad. And you'll have, again, everything you need to be successful on that exam. Okay, so come to class on Monday on Big Blue Button, again, remotely, everybody. Prepared to ask questions or talk about topics from the development chapter and also from the object relations or personality or really any just general questions from any of the material that have been discussed in the lectures. Okay. Hope everybody has a good day and I'll see you Monday.